All right, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lydia Staisch for joining us today for our seminar speaker. Lydia and I actually met maybe 2 years ago at GSA field trip. That was leading that Lydia took with me, and I think she was doing some background research for our Earth MRI project that she's helping supervise. So Lydia works for the USGS out of the Pacific Northwest Mapping Group. And before that, she was a Mendenhall postdoc fellow with the USGS and was a PhD student at the University of Michigan, actually, which we did not make this connection until today, but she studied with Peter Yakovev, who used to work here. So they were dear friends. So we are quite excited to have Lydia here today and share with us some of her recent and ongoing research about river organization across the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rocky Mountains. So take it away, Lydia.
Hi, all. Thank you so much for having me. So this talk today is partially based on a paper that was published in 2022 in GSAB and some ongoing research that we've been doing to nail down how major rivers like the Snake and the Columbia, the Salmon and the Clearwater have evolved over the past 13 to 15 million years, and what geodynamic drivers are driving those rivers to change over time. And so this is a pretty broad spatial study covering Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and a little bit of Montana too, of course. And I argue that there's actually some really important clues in Southwest Montana's geology to this story that I'm excited to learn more about and continue working with Dan and others on. So let's see if I can advance. Okay, so this is the region that we'll be talking about today. So the Snake River currently starts near the Yellowstone Hotspot National Park and goes into the eastern Snake River Plain, where it meets up with the Columbia Basin, where it incises through North America's deepest canyon, Hell's Canyon here, and meets up with the Columbia Basin and the Columbia River, and eventually drains out into the ocean. But as recently as 1898, geoscientists noticed some unusual things about Hell's Canyon specifically, so we'll focus into this topographic map here, where they found there are these barbed tributaries where the modern river flows from south to north. However, these barbed tributaries like Indian Creek, Pine Creek, and Wild Horse Creek are kind of pointing the wrong direction, suggesting that perhaps at some point in the past, this reach of the Snake River actually flowed from north to south. Furthermore, they also found thick sequences of lake sediments in the western Snake River Plain. This is Lake Idaho that existed from roughly Miocene-Pleistocene time, typically from 12-ish MA until about 2.5 MA. There's a couple different phases to the lake system, and I'll talk about the stratigraphy and what we've learned about it then. But so to basically explain why the rivers may have flowed in the wrong way and why there was a large lake system in Lake Idaho in central in the western Snake River Plain over Miocene and Pleistocene time, a lot of people were asking, well, where did the Snake River go and how did it join with the Columbia Basin, if it did at all? So here's a picture of Hell's Canyon, where we have this really nice, I'll use the cursor for folks online, this really nice peneplain highland region, and steeply incised, where the Snake River is at the bottom. This is near Pittsburgh Landing. And again, the Snake River currently connects to the Columbia Basin through this route. But if the rivers were flowing away from Hell's Canyon in the wrong direction compared to today, then where did the Snake River go? And how and when did Hell's Canyon incise? So just for comparison, here's the topographic profile of the Grand Canyon. So Hell's Canyon is really, really, really steep. So to talk about this, we also want to talk about why rivers might change. And these are some of the hypotheses that people have talked about for why the Snake River may have changed over time. So faulting or tectonic uplift, if fast enough, could potentially change a river course. But for rivers as large as the Snake River, that would have to be quite fast tectonic uplift along explicit fault systems. Another idea is that there would be potentially volcanic flows that block in a canyon region and cause an upland or upstream drainage to turn into a more of a lacustrine environment for some period of time. And another popular hypothesis is that dynamic topography, possibly caused by a thermal plume like the Yellowstone hotspot, could cause broad uplift over a region and shift drainages away from that uplifted terrain. So to understand the differences between these different mechanisms, how they might be acting on these environments and along these major river systems, I would also argue that using really diverse data sets and integrating them across broad regional scales is really quite helpful to answering these questions. So there are some previous hypotheses on how the Snake River may have flowed in the past before it incised through Hell's Canyon. One of the most popular ones is that the Snake River flowed out of the Lake Idaho region on the west side of the Wallowa Mountains. So this is sort of the Baker Valley route, initially hypothesized by Livingston in 1928 and later by Terry Tolan and Steve Rydell. So here are the Wallowa Mountains here. Another popular hypothesis that was driven a lot by fish biology and paleontology is that the lake in the Western Snake River Plain flowed out of the modern Owyhee River drainage system across Nevada and over the Sierra Mountains. And this is because some of the Miocene-Pleistocene fish fossils in Lake Idaho are fairly similar to some of the modern river species found in the Sacramento River drainage. I think it's also really helpful to look at what the modern topography is of the Snake River and compare it to some of these hypotheses. So here in blue on this diagram, I have the modern Snake River going from its headwaters to its confluence with the Columbia River in blue here. And you can see there's some pretty prominent nick points along the river system. I've also dotted in the line of the maximum lake level of Idaho based on the, stratigraphic horizons left in the environment. And so this Livingston hypothesis along this pink pathway over here is shown topographically over here. And you can see there's just a little bit of a bedrock sill over here. So this is a plausible hypothesis on where the Snake River went. And you don't have to really induce a lot of tectonic uplift mechanisms along that reach to make that make sense. When we compare that to the Sacramento River pathway, there's a lot more topography in the way. And so for that to be a more viable hypothesis, either the lake level of Lake Idaho would have had to be much, much higher than is thought based on what's left in the environment and the geology, or there must have been a considerable amount of uplift in these portions of the landscape over the past few million years to make that make sense. So some more recent results, and this is referring to that paper that my colleagues and I wrote a couple of years ago, is based on some fairly new detrital zircon results from stratigraphic horizons throughout this portion of the landscape. So the stratigraphic units that I'll be talking about are the Ringgold Formation in central Washington here at these orange dots, the 6 Mile Creek Formation and the gravels at the Monida Pass in blue, the Clarkston Heights gravels in this little green dot over here, and the sediment throughout the Snake River Plain, the Western Snake River Plain in these blue dots here. And so what we noticed from looking at detrital zircon data sets, and I'll show more graphs on this later, is that the 6 Mile Creek Formation had some detrital zircon populations in it that were very similar to the detrital zircon populations in the Ringgold Formation. And simply put, there were a lot of these really old ages, these Archean ages from the upper Snake River, basically a lot of this recycled material from the Craton and from Mesozoic and Paleozoic stratigraphy that have gotten somehow into central Washington. We also noticed that here in the Clarkston Heights gravels, that I'll talk a lot more about later, along the modern Snake River, don't have these really old ages, suggesting that the upper Snake, what is now the modern upper Snake, was not flowing along a pathway that got to this portion of the region. Along Baker Valley, we collected some sediments, and there's also some fish fossil data sets suggest that this is not a viable pathway because the zircons are much more locally sourced. They're not showing anything similar to what's being deposited in the Western Snake River Plain, and the fish fossils are also pretty different. And so that Baker Valley route doesn't seem like it was supported by the data in the Baker Valley sediments. And finally, we found that the Lake Idaho sediments over time, over the 10-ish to 2-ish million years, changed from having fairly local sources, mainly from the Idaho batholith and other local stuff coming into this region from north and south, to having a more diverse provenance. Basically, the sediment was coming from further afield. Suggesting that the Snake River kind of changed, and what was being deposited into the Snake River Plain at that time was changing at about 4.3 MA, and that was a previous number that I'll revise in this talk. So to kind of connect a lot of these data sets together, our initial hypothesis was, well, what if the Snake River didn't flow into the Western Snake River Plain at all, but actually just circumnavigated the Northern Rocky Mountains? And when I was first putting together this data and trying to come up with, a hypothesis like this or others, I thought this was pretty wild and doesn't, I'm a fairly conservative geologist, I'd say, and this felt like kind of a wild hypothesis to say that this major river system has shifted so dramatically in Pliocene or Miocene time. But this is what the data sets at the time were really supporting, and I'll show you some new data sets today that refine this hypothesis, but seem to still suggest that this may be pretty close to the truth of what was happening at the time. So in this hypothesis, I'm going through sort of a time progression of how things we think have changed, was that as we're suggesting, there was a large river that included a lot of what is now the Upper Snake River that circumnavigated the Northern Rocky Mountains and allowed for the zircons sourced from way over here to get into the Columbia River, but not allowing them to get onto Lake Idaho at the time between about 10 to 6.5 MA. So there's a hypothesized drainage divide between the eastern and western Snake River Plain, which is at that time also kind of close to where the Peekaboo Volcanic Center of the Yellowstone hotspot is. And we also proposed, and as others had in the past, that the Hells Canyon was not an fluvial route at that time. As time progressed and the Yellowstone hotspot moved further to the east, then that drainage divide may have migrated slightly until eventually subsidence in the eastern Snake River Plain defeated that uplift signal, and the drainage divide that was previously between the two portions of the basin, they became integrated again. And then at some point in the past, sometime after we think about 3.3 MA, major incision in Hells Canyon took place, allowing the Western Snake River Plain to finally be connected to the Eastern Snake River, or to the Columbia Basin. So that's the sort of a set of diagrams that we had in our 2022 paper. So for this talk, I want to refine that hypothesis a little bit more, looking at some of the sites we looked at before in a little bit more detail and adding a couple of new data sets as well. So we'll be looking at the Hagerman fossil beds, which is part of the Upper Glens Ferry Formation. That's a younger phase from about 4 to 3.5 MA or 3.0 MA of Lake Idaho. We'll be looking at the Chalk Hills Formation, which is a little bit further downstream, but is an older history, so between about 11 and 6 million years in age. We'll be looking a little bit further downstream on the other side of Hells Canyon in the Clarkston Heights Gravels. And then finally, we'll end up looking at the Ringgold Formation. And so the different questions that we're asking at these different locations is, in the Snake River Plain, we're asking, what is the history of the drainage divide in this region? From the Clarkston Heights Gravels, we're going to learn about how and when was Hells Canyon incised, and where did the Western Snake River Plain drain into, or did it drain at all, before that incision happened. And from the Ringgold Formation, we're asking, how did the downstream Columbia River Basin network, how was it configured over time, and did it change? Okay, and then, so first I want to kind of go over what the basic methods that we're doing at many of these different sites that we'll go through. So first we're going to be looking at the sedimentology, looking at local depositional environments and how they change. And in places where we have beautiful fluvial conglomerates like this, we'll be looking at class composition and comparing to what modern river gravels look like. In some places, we have really excellent tephrochronology, especially the Hagerman fossil beds in that Glens Ferry Formation, where my colleague Laura Walkup has been doing a lot of work to analyze volcanic ash within the stratigraphy and use it for age control and correlation across the monument and across different places where the Glens Ferry Formation is deposited. And then most of this talk is really going to be focused on detrital zircon provenance analysis. So here we're using the zircon ages in those sands, basically everything around these clasts, to identify source terrains. And we're going to be using modern rivers as a proxy for the past. And I'll show you how we do that here. So we collect ancestral river samples from these sandstones throughout the landscape and sift out the zircons. We also collect modern river sands, so basically just an active fluvial channel, collect a bag of sand, and we sift out the zircons. We use LAICPMS uranium lead age dating to date about 120 or more zircons per sample, and in some cases we have data sets with over 300 grains. And the result is a detrital zircon age spectrum. I know a lot of you are already very familiar with looking at these, but just for everyone, I'll explain on what we're kind of looking at. So basically on the x-axis, we're looking at age in billions of years. So where there's age peaks, there are zircons dated of that particular age. And the relative height of the age peaks is basically showing the relative abundance of zircons of that age group. So here I have a modern river sample of the Snake River. It's a composite actually of two samples that I've collected. And one of the things we can do is, of course, just look at what are the age groups and what do they seem to correlate to. So some of the known age groups that seem to occur, at least in the Snake River and some of the downstream samples, are in these color-coded bars. So we've got stuff from the Wyoming Craton, some stuff from, I'm going to pause for just a second. Can whoever is talking, please mute your microphone?
Hindi siya yan.
I think you can go.
Ha?
Oh, can I?
Yeah.
Basta mustabi
Okay.
kamera.
Let me see if I can. Participant. Audio.
Yeah,
I think it worked. Did it work? Did someone already do it?
go to the people in the left.
Participate like this one?
Wait a minute.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, you can go mute all at the bottom there.
Oh, okay. Well, this is fine.
That's well,
Okay.
thank you.
So sorry to mute everyone, but I'm talking. So, okay. So the purple bars are coming from a lot of the zircon data sets that are typical of what's being recycled through Miocene or Mesozoic and Paleozoic stratigraphy, as well as from the Craton. So purple comes from Upper Snake. The sort of yellowish and orangish and reddish ones are coming from various different detrital zircon age populations that are found in stuff like central Idaho. So we've got a lot of Atlanta low batholith ages, shallowest volcanics, some from the Yellowstone hotspot, that kind of thing. And this important one is the Lemhi doublet, which is kind of a two age peak sort of thing that we'll see a lot in like the Salmon River drainage. And then the blue ones over here are really only relevant for downstream samples in the Ringgold Formation, but those are some of the age groups that we see in coming out of the Cascade Range. So, okay, got off topic here. Okay, so when we look at a lot of the modern rivers, so this is looking at the Snake River, the Methdown, the Okanagan, the Spokane, Yakima, Columbia, Salmon, and Clearwater. These are the major rivers we're looking at for 2022 paper. What is important for this analysis to work is that all the rivers look different. They have different zircon age populations, and the uniqueness of those modern spectra is really essential for this analysis to work out. And the Snake River seems to be one of the only ones that really has super strong Archean age groups and Yavapai Mesozoic ages, as well as these Grenville ages in this pink zone over here. The Lemhi doublet, as I alluded to earlier, is really common in the Salmon River system, where we've got this really strong 1380 age peak and the Clearwater system coming out of the Shoup-Algan gneiss. And it also overlaps with some ages near the Yavapai Mesozoic age range. And so those end up being some of the really important age populations that we see in the modern rivers, and they'll also play a lot into the detrital zircon provenance of our ancestral rivers. So another thing we can do with these detrital zircon data sets is compare modern rivers to our ancestral sample. And the reason why we do this is because modern rivers, we know the upstream drainage area and we know the upstream geology. And so we use them as proxies for portions of the landscape to compare to our samples downstream. So this is an example of a kernel density estimate from the Ringgold Formation. We can look at it like this, or we can also plot it as a cumulative density function with basically age and cumulative probability on the y-axis. So basically every steep portion of this graph means there's a lot of ages of that particular group. So a lot of 50s and 100s, and then these are some of those Archean ages coming in where that steep portion is. When we compare it to a lot of the modern river systems that are in this rainbow sort of range, you can see that none of them really overlap that well, which makes sense. We're in a basin, we're downstream of many of these rivers, and so it makes sense that you can't necessarily look at one river and it's going to match at a downstream sample where there's a lot of other stuff coming in. So instead of looking at just one modern river and comparing it to, or many modern rivers and comparing them individually, what we can do is something called a detrital zircon mixing model. So this is a code that Kurt Sundell and Joel Saylor published in 2017. It's super useful and very user-friendly too, where instead of, we use these modern rivers as sources and then we're able to synthetically mix them together. And it kind of looks like this a little bit. So these are now mixtures of all those modern rivers as potential sources. And we mix them together. We look at the age groups that kind of come out of the results. We do this about 100,000 times. And on all the graphs, I'll be showing the ones that actually plot up here are the top 1%. So that's best 100 models out of that 100,000 that are initially modeled. And we can also find a best fit model that you can see now overlaps that detrital zircon sample from the Ringgold Formation, as an example, much, much better than any of those individual rivers did. So this is a lot of the basis of the mixing models and interpretations that I'll be making down the road. Another result that comes out of this is from the modeling software is that if you have a sample downstream, it gives you a relative proportion of that upstream drainage area. So if you put something as a source in the model and it says maybe it's got 1 or 2%, then that's suggesting it's a weak contributing source and that maybe it wasn't even involved in the larger drainage area that was being deposited downstream. Or if something is 10%, 20%, 90% or more, that suggests it's a really important drainage that may have been involved in deposition further downstream, or at least that part of the landscape may have been involved in deposition of that ancestral river sand. So that's kind of what we end up doing. This map, very messy, very colorful, is of all the different modern drainages that we're using as possible sources in these detrital zircon mixing models. So again, they serve as proxies. A lot of the times we'll start our mixing models with many of these as potential sources, and we sort of whittle them down. The ones that have really low percentages, we sort of eliminate them and see if the model does better with fewer, like eliminating those sources that seem unimportant. And then we kind of continue on this way until we find some really good best fit models that explain the samples that we've collected from the stratigraphy. So I'm going to first start in the Hagerman fossil bed. So we're upstream. This is a little index map of where we are. The sedimentology of the Glens Ferry Formation deposited here at the Hagerman fossil beds is typically very fine, very sandy, lacustrine, and low energy fluvial environment. There are these really nice paleosols occasionally. This one's a really carbon rich one called paper shales deposited in the environment. And next I'll show you a map of the Hagerman fossil beds. So in this topographic map over here, there's a ton of colorful dots. Those are not my samples. Those are actually the tephra that Laura Walkup has mapped and analyzed and compared across the monument. So this is really abundant mappable horizons that she has laid out the stratigraphy for the Hagerman fossil beds. And so this tephra chronology and careful mapping that Laura and others have done form the basis of our sampling for provenance analysis. It helps us understand what's the age and what's the relative context of all these different samples that we're taking. So for the detrital zircon samples, we really focused mainly in the Peters Gulch section and in the Horse Quarry section way up here, because those are areas where the stratigraphy is relatively well exposed and we have a relatively complete section. So this is just a simple stratigraphic diagram showing where some of these tephra ages come into play and where our samples have been collected. So we have tephra ages from about 3.9 MA to 3.1, and then some stratigraphy a little bit higher than that. The base of the section here is basically the water level of the Snake River. We couldn't go any lower than that. And then it goes about 230 meters up into above the river level. So the samples that I've collected, I've got a whole bunch. I haven't analyzed them all yet, or some of them are still in the lab, but the ones that I've sampled are highlighted in bold green. So we've got them younger than 3.1 MA and some that are about the same age as this 3.9 MA ash. So in the next few diagrams, what I'm going to be showing are the results from our detrital zircon modeling. The lower map here is showing what are the different sources that we're using as potential contributors. So here we're using a lot of the drainages in the eastern Snake River Plain as well as the western Snake River Plain. And I'm highlighting in red the ones that are important for different portions of the stratigraphy. On the top diagrams, what I'm showing are a cumulative density function with our sample in red, and the good fit models are in gray, and the best fit is in black. And then the results of the relative proportions that are contributing to these sediments from the DZ mixed models are shown as pie charts. So I'm going to be trying to be really consistent with my color coding and what I'm showing so that you can kind of see how this progresses from stratigraphy through time and through space. So the lowest stratigraphic unit that we have a DZ sample for is about 3.9 MA. And we're seeing there's a lot of material coming out of basically mostly the Wood River here, Wood River system, maybe some from the Big Lost Trough over here, the Port Neuf River and the Raft River system. So, you know, kind of this sort of area that's kind of downstream of where the Picou Volcanic Center was earlier in time in the Miocene. When we go a little bit higher in the stratigraphy, a lot of the samples look fairly similar, and the strata that is deposited between about 3.75 to 3.1 MA show a slight increase in the relative proportion of zircons coming from the eastern Snake River Plain. So we can see a lot more of this kind of part of the landscape seems to be contributing into that portion of the stratigraphy. So about 33%. And you can kind of see that if I toggle between the samples, you can sort of see this increase in the relative number of those old ages specifically. And then when we go to our youngest samples that are younger than 3.1 MA, we see about 50% of the zircon data sets seem to be coming from the upper Snake River and the eastern Snake River Plain, including Henry's Fork and the South Fork of the Snake River. So to this to me suggests that before 3.9 MA, there was a drainage divide somewhere in the eastern and western Snake River Plain. We're not getting a lot of those really old zircons from the uppermost Snake River. By about 3.1 MA, maybe a little bit earlier, the Lake Idaho watershed increased to include that eastern Snake River Plain landscape. If we go a little bit further back in time, the story is fairly similar. So now I'm looking at the Chalk Hills Formation, dated between about 11.4 and 6 million years in age. Its sedimentology is pretty variable. We've got a lot of arcosic sands at the base of the formation. The Poison Creek Formation is arguably part of the Chalk Hills, but it's dated between about 9 and 11.4 MA, and we've got a sample from there. Relatively volcaniclastic and fine stratigraphy in the middle, and then at the top, one of the samples we have is from the uppermost Chalk Hills Turtling Springs Formation. That's between about 7.9 and 6 MA, so we kind of bracketed that time range. And the Chalk Hills Formation, again, they're older than the Glenns Ferry Formation. You find the Glenns Ferry Formation, which I just talked about it from Hagerman, overlying it and an angular unconformity in a lot of places. So from here, similar idea, same pie charts that we're showing. But in this case, we're a little bit further west. And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of material coming from this sort of northern portion of the Snake River Plain. So the Boise River, the Payette River, and the Big Lost River are major contributors. And this is for the Poison Creek Formation, that older unit that I mentioned earlier. When we look up in the Turtling Springs Formation, it's actually pretty similar. So a lot of Payette, a lot of Boise, a lot of Wood River, and not much coming from here, if any at all. So the take home here is that drainage divide still seemed to have been in that general area, somewhere between the eastern and western Snake River Plain, in this time period between about 11.4 and 6 MA. And this is going to be an important take home too that I want you to remember, but the Payette and the Boise part of the landscape is a major contributor into the western Snake River Plain at this time period. And this is going to be important to comparing to our next site, which is the Clarkston Heights Gravels. So we're now on the downstream side of Hell's Canyon. So the Clarkston Heights Gravels, they are on this geologic map, which spans like several states and took me forever to put together, is this sort of teal colored unit here. It is a paleo channel of the Snake River. So here on this map, the Snake River flows out of Hell's Canyon down into the Lewiston Basin. Here's Lewiston, Idaho. Here's Clarkston, Washington, and it meets up with the Clearwater River right here. So this paleo channel here was involved in, as part of the paleo snake from about 12 to 10 MA and a little bit younger, where these Clarkston Heights gravels are deposited on top of a basalt that we locally call the Elephant Mountain basalt. It's part of the Columbia River flood basalts. So the 10 million year old Elephant Mountain basalt followed this paleo channel. So did the underlying 12 million year old Pomona basalt in this region. And then the Clarkston Heights gravels are on top of that. However, this paleo channel and this unit predates the 6 million year old lower monumental basalt flow in this region. So it's kind of hard to see, but there's these darker purples along the Clearwater River and along the Snake River as near its modern location, and much lower in the landscape, so they're much closer to the modern river system. And those are of the lower monumental flow. It's basically the last gasp of the Columbia River flood basalt, dated between about 6 to 5.5 MA. So that tells us that the Clarkston Heights gravels, which they're gravels, so they're like impossible to date themselves. There's like nothing to date in them. They're bracketed by the 10 MA basalt on the bottom that they're deposited on, and they must predate the modern river configuration that the lower monumental flow at 6 MA follows. So they're really similar time range to the Chalk Hills Formation. The samples that we've taken for detrital zircon analysis come, and some of the stratigraphic correlations that we've made and observations that we made come from these really well-exposed quarries that are in Clarkston Heights, Washington. It's sort of a suburb of the area. So here's the region where they come from. This is a blow-up of the LiDAR. And the gravels are just very, very coarse. So dominantly conglomeratic clasts, cobble size, occasionally a small boulder. So we've got a really high energy fluvial environment here. And the class composition is quite variable. So we've got lots of green metamorphic rocks. We've got some metavolcanics as well, some mafic volcanics coming from the Columbia River flood basalts probably, and a lot of quartzites, which are these sort of tannish, goldish cobbles that we've got in this region. So now that we actually have a fluvial facies, before we were looking at really fine strata, what we can do is we can look at those class compositions as another proxy for which rivers may have been involved in deposition in this environment. So apparently I love pie charts because here's some more pie charts, but these are class compositions with general class type shown in the bottom from the modern rivers in this region. So we've got the Salmon River, the Snake River near Pittsburgh Landing, a couple Clearwater gravels, and the confluence of the Snake River. So the class types that show up a lot in the Snake River and everywhere is these mafic volcanics. So this is a Columbia River flood basalt. We got a lot of it in the area. In the Snake River and in the Salmon, we see a lot of metamorphic greenstones, and that comes from a lot of the accreted terrains that are incised into. They're underlying the Columbia River flood basalts in this region. So the Seven Devils for supergroup and that, or supergroup, I don't know, Seven Devils group and all that kind of stuff. We've got some greenish phanerites, as these pink triangles, and then these dark blue ones that are kind of important. Those are our quartzites that we find in pretty good abundance. So on here, where these, class compositions are showing up, the one that looks the most similar to the Paleo Snake, Clarkston Heights gravels, is this one at the confluence of the Snake and the Clearwater. So that's not a huge surprise. 6 million years ago, we had the same general river configuration, it seems, perhaps, and that the class composition is suggesting that we're somewhere in the downstream reach, pretty close to where the Snake and the Clearwater River came together 12 or 10 to 6 million years ago. Yeah, and so this is just a map, a very generalized geologic map of where we are. So a lot of that phaneritic material and the metasediments are coming from, the Salmon River. More of the metasediments, the more of the greenstones are really coming from the Baker terrain and the Wallowa terrain exposed in the Hells Canyon region. And then all this orange stuff is Columbia River flood basalt. So that explains why we have so much of this sort of teal color. Okay, so tons of gravel, but we can look at class composition in general, but we can also look at through the stratigraphy. So we had this idea to sort of look at the class composition and the flow direction as it changes through about 120 meters of gravel. And so that's what I'm showing on these rose diagrams. They're color-coded, same colors as before, with the class compositions. And then we can see that, over the majority of the stratigraphy of the Clarkston Heights gravel, which is, again, very coarse, we've got strong northward transport directions. And the class compositions, again, they've got a lot of those greenstones, a lot of the mafic volcanics, and some quartzites showing up. The one oddball is this uppermost gravel that is flowing pretty strongly westward and has kind of a reduced amount of that metasediment and metabasalt in it. So those greenstones were kind of gone. And instead we got an increase in the amount of mafic volcanics and an increase in the amount of a relative proportion of quartzites that we were seeing. So initially we thought, oh my God, there's a huge change here. What happened? So of course, as is my fate, I did some detrital zircon analysis. So the samples that we have are, 4 samples throughout the stratigraphy. And what we started to do again was more DC mix modeling. They all looked fairly similar, which kind of like killed my joy that the top sample was like super different and exciting. But there's still some excitement. So don't worry. So within the stratigraphy, they seemed relatively similar, even though the class compositions were suggesting otherwise. So for the DC mix models that I'm going to show you after I take a sip, I'm doing something a little bit different here. Instead of just using one setup model, I'm actually going to test 3 different hypotheses here. So in all of the configurations, all of my potential sources are the Salmon River, the Clearwater River, a handful of small drainages in the Hells Canyon Reach, the Powder River, the Grand Ronde River, and the Imnaha Rivers. But what's happening upstream of the Hells Canyon, I'm varying. So in the first model, I use a potential source as this location, Farewell Bend, along the modern Snake River, that basically the modern river sources all of this area up here. So this is using the upper Snake, basically asking, okay, can we explain the detrital zircon patterns in the Clarkson Heights gravels using the model, the modern rivers as a proxy? The next model was to use no snake at all. So I set up the model, but I exclude the Snake River as a possible source to see, does it do better, does it do worse? And then the last model I do is I use just a lot of the Western Snake River Plain sources that we're getting into the Western Snake River Plain at the same time in the Chalk Hills Formation as possible sources. So we got a lot of cumulative density functions to look at, or density plots to look at. These columns here are the 3 different models. So the Western Snake River Plain model, the no snake model, and using the Snake River at Farewell Bend. And so these samples are from the lowest stratigraphic sample to the uppermost stratigraphic sample. And you can see these 2 samples in the middle specifically are the ones that are pretty sensitive to which model we end up using. And so the Snake River Farewell Bend model doesn't do a good job. This red line does not overlap with these black ones or these gray ones. Same with the no snake model. But this Western Snake River Plain model does do a pretty good job. So we're pretty happy with how well those models are fitting that data. When we look at the pie charts again, my favorite thing, we see that there's a lot of material coming out of the Clearwater and the Salmon, not a big surprise. And there's a lot of material coming out of the Payette, the Boise, Reynolds Creek, Wood River. So again, that's this portion of the landscape. So my major take-home message here is that the detrital zircon data sets that best fit where sources include tributaries that were being deposited into the Snake River Plain at the same time, but not in the Eastern Snake River Plain because that Farewell Bend model was garbage. So same sources to Lake Idaho. So that suggests to me that Hells Canyon between 6 and 10 million years ago was likely incised, at least to some degree, and the through-going river linking the Western Snake River Plain and the Columbia Basin at that time. So that is different from what a lot of people have suggested. Most people thought that it incised much more recently. And in fact, I will show you some data that also suggest that it incised much more frequently. So it's complicated is what the answer is going to be. So this is paper. It's in press at PNAS with my colleague Matthew Morris. And he did this really cool study where he went into Hells Canyon, and there are these caves high above the modern river system. And some of these caves, he searched like 30 of them. He found fluvial strata trapped in these caves. And they're, some of these caves are 375 meters to 42 meters above the modern river. So they're way high up. So you get that sediment in that cave, those caves were formed, and to get that sand was deposited in there at the time that the Snake River or whatever was going through Hells Canyon was way higher up than it is now. So really cool idea, because what he did then was use cosmogenic burial dating to date how old these sands were. So he's able to look at these, basically track where the incision, how fast the incision of the Snake River through Hells Canyon was through time. And so the cave sediments, the highest one dated was 5.5 MA, which is kind of the limit of this burial dating technique. And then the middle one is about 2.7 MA. And then the lowest one was 1.5 MA. When we plot this on a graph, so here's our uppermost cave, we got time on the y-axis. elevation on the x-axis, or sorry, switch that. And then, so we've got the caves of these different dots, and we cannot fit these data sets with a single line. So that suggests that incision changed over time. So these age elevation plots can't be fit with a single linear solution, but they can be fit with a piecewise linear solution, basically slow incision rate, fast incision rate. So we use this piecewise linear regression. It's a Monte Carlo method that my husband, Richard Styron, actually came up with for fault slip rate dating or modeling. And I said, wait, that's the same math as incision rates. Let's use it here. So we used it here. And it's a nice model for getting out a probability density function or a histogram of what the incision rates were over time to fit this data really well, and also when they changed. And so the earliest incision rate captured by these first two caved sediments was very slow, very, very slow, 0.009. And then after some period in time, it seems to have increased fairly dramatically to about 0.16 millimeters per year, which is a nice, moderate, healthy incision rate. And then the timing that it changed was somewhere about 2.1 million years ago. Okay, so how do we reconcile this with our Clarkston Heights gravel data? Because I just said that the Hells Canyon was incised before 6 MA, but now I'm also saying that Hells Canyon incised rapidly, starting at 2.1 MA. So the way we can figure this out is to look at some other strata downstream. So the Ringgold Formation, it's something I've been working on for some number of years, maybe almost 10 years now. It's this fluvial and lacustrine strata far downstream in the Columbia Basin. Overall, it's dated between about 10 MA at the base to about 3 MA or a little bit younger at the top. So it's kind of spanning this time period between the Glenns Ferry Formation and the Chalk Hills Formation and the Clarkston Heights gravels. So this is some of the nice sands that we get out of it in this field photo. So the stratigraphy changes over time. For the first 9.5 to 5 MA, we've got the wooded island members, dominantly fluvial, very gravel rich, some overbank deposits for the first part of the history. The second part of this stratigraphy is a Taylor Flat member. It's between about 4 to 5 MA, and it's more low energy fluvial deposits, much more sandy. We kind of lose those big gravels. And then the last phase between about 3 to 4 MA is lacustrine. Some very fine sort of quasi-fluvial strata in there too. And we have some paleosols suggesting that there was ephemeral drying of this lake system. We've got pretty good age control throughout the section. So we've got tephra as old as 9.5 MA, and the uppermost one is about 3.47 MA from some nice uranium lead dates from my postdoc. And then we think it continues on to about 3 MA. We don't have the absolute top dated though. So that's a little bit of a fuzzy number right there. It's spatially pretty variable over this region. So here is the modern river system. So we've got the Columbia River, the Snake River comes in here, incises through Wallula Gap over here. The blue polygons on this map are of the Ringgold Formation locations. The colorful dots are the samples. So I've got a population in the north and a population in the south. And I've kind of labeled them through the stratigraphy. And this color coding will make sense in just a second. So N means north, S means south. And we also have some other correlative strata at the same time, deposited roughly at the same time that we were looking at. One is the Snipes Mountain conglomerate located here. We've got some stuff at the Goldendale gravels that are underlying this 4.2 MA volcanic unit called the Simcoe Volcanics. And then we've got samples way, way, way downstream, almost in Portland, where I live, at the Troutdale formations that are about 3 to 4 MA. And so we're comparing all of this stratigraphy to look at which rivers we're depositing into this region. So we've got some cumulative density plots to look at from the Ringgold zircons. Now my color coding is going to start to make sense because we've noticed that there's actually quite a lot of variation in this one sedimentary unit. So this uppermost prograding sand has a ton of these really old ages, which is weird. I didn't expect that. And I didn't see it before either in the samples that I had analyzed for the 2022 paper. Then these midsection sands all kind of in the north and the south kind of plot similarly. And then a lot of the gravel deposits are up here. So they've got more young sample or more young ages, and they still have some of these really old ages, but not quite as many, not same high abundance. And when we plot the Snipes Mountain conglomerate, it looks really similar to this midsection sand, somewhere in there. Okay, more detrital zircon models. So here I'm kind of doing a similar framework to the ones that we explored in the Clarkston Heights gravels, but I'm adding some other major drainages that come into the Columbia Basin. So we've got the Spokane River, this Columbia River near Canada, the Methau River, no, this is the Okanagan, the Methau, and the Yakima rivers to add to our data set. But same basic idea. One sample without the Snake River, another sample with the Western Snake River Plain, the next one with the Western and the Eastern Snake River Plain, just to check. And then finally, Montana comes into my story. I'm sorry I left you guys to the end. But these data sets came out much more recently along some of the upper Missouri drainages, and we included these in one of the models too. And it turns out that's the best model. So I'm not gonna bother with the no snake model because I already established that it was a terrible model for some of the previous data. But so these are many of the different samples that we have throughout the Columbia, in the Columbia Basin in the Ringgold Formation. And so the red again is our samples. These are our best fit models. And the first one I'm showing is of just using the Western Snake River Plain. Some samples, it does an okay job, but many of them, it's not even close, just a really terrible fit. When we include the Eastern Snake River Plain, it's starting to get a little better. Some of these are doing a better job of matching the models with the data, but this one still can't really handle it. And then finally, when I include the upper Missouri River, specifically the Jefferson and the Madison rivers, we do a lot better of a job with these samples from the northern portion of the Ringgold Formation. This one's still a little hard to get. You're kind of limited by the samples that you have. So, still a little work to do there, but it's a lot better than it was before. So, more pie charts. Okay, so I'm going to try and go through the stratigraphy through time and include space here. So the lower fluvial gravels of the Ringgold Formation, we've got some that are dated about 6.8 MA here. And they're showing a lot of zircons coming from Eastern Snake River Plain, like the Little Lost River, some of this South Fork of the Snake River, and there's that bright yellow triangle. It's going to be the upper Missouri. In the south, on the Taylor Flat conglomerate, that's that fluvial facies of the Ringgold Formation down here. It looks really different. Clearwater, salmon, and a lot of the stuff coming out of the Western Snake River Plain. That looks to me like very similar to the results we got from the the Clarkston Heights gravels. Same time zone, different place. So what I think is that this sample is from a river that was very similar to what was draining into the Clarkston Heights area near the Hells Canyon, but it's different than the river that we're seeing up here. And then the Snipes Mountain conglomerate downstream here, overall looks a little bit more similar. We've got a lot of upper Missouri River, upper Snake River, and some of the other sort of local cascade-derived zircon sources. So I hypothesize that in this earlier phase of the Ringgold Formation, kind of the same time as the Chalk Hills Formation and the Clarkston Heights gravels further upstream, we've actually got two rivers traversing the Columbia Basin. One coming out of the Paleo Hells Canyon and includes the upper Snake River, not the upper Snake River, the Western Snake River Plain. And then another one that is sourcing a lot of the zircons from the Eastern Snake River Plain, including potentially parts of what is now the upper Missouri drainage. So the Simcoe volcanics, when they erupted, we're not totally sure if this is the mechanism, but right after they erupted, this Ringgold Formation became a lake. So potentially we clogged the Columbia River and it stopped depositing fluvial facies stuff and sort of started being more of a lacustrine facies. But we also start noticing that the zircon sources seem to change a little bit. Specifically in the southern part of the Ringgold Formation, we've got a huge mixture. This is like the most colorful pie chart I could make. Basically, our idea is that as this lake system kind of started to be deposited, these rivers coalesced, and the zircon sources coming from this river and whatever else was coming out of the Cascades are all kind of mixing together in this lacustrine system. Okay, so I also forgot to mention that there's a really odd inset channel in the northern portion of our lake system. This is the youngest sample of the Ringgold Formation that I have. And it is just absolutely dominated by these old ages. A lot of Eastern Snake River Plain, kind of Little Lost Rivers are proxy, and a lot of that upper Missouri, Madison, Jefferson, sort of detrital zircon provenance. Basically, it's a ton of old ages. And we don't know how else to get it in there except to include those zircon sources. That sample comes from this field site over here, where we have this nice flat inset fluvial facies. And in some places, it starts to look like more like a little prograding sand. And it's inset into this tilted Ringgold Formation. So this is a much younger inset fluvial facies. And we think that it may have actually been deposited when the lake system started to drain. And after some amount of minor deformation on the Saddle Mountains Fault. So I'm going to try and put all these different disparate data sets together. So we've got 3 different columns, and these diagrams on the left are sort of going to guide us through what we think is happening. Well, we've got 3 different columns of what's going on in the Snake River Plain, Hell's Canyon, and the Columbia Basin. So earlier in the Miocene, between about 10 to 4.2 MA, we think, based on these GZ data sets, that the Eastern Snake River Plain and the Western Snake River Plain were somewhat divided, starting at least by 11.4 MA and lasting until about 6-ish MA or maybe a little bit younger. At the same time, Hell's Canyon was a through-going fluvial route linking the Western Snake River Plain to the Columbia Basin. So that's a revision from our prior idea. And then what's happening in the Columbia Basin further downstream is that we've got these 2 river systems. One coming in from the north that sources a lot of that older material in southwest Montana, upper Snake River, that kind of thing, and one that is coming from central Idaho. After about 4.2 MA until about 3.1 MA, the Eastern Snake River Plain is iteratively consumed and captured by the Western Snake River Plain. This is also similar to the onset of subsidence by a few different data sets of the Eastern Snake River Plain. And this also, we think, is related to the Yellowstone hotspot and its thermal buoyant effect, sort of moving out of this region. In Hell's Canyon, not a lot different is going on. We actually don't have a sedimentary record here, but we presume, based on the cave data sets, that we have slow, continuous incision at a slow rate. And in the Columbia Basin, we have the Simcoe volcanics cause the onset of lacustrine deposition, and the lake is starting to mix zircons from many different sources. And then lastly, after 3.1 MA, the Snake River Plain was fully absorbed the upper Snake River drainages that used to flow to the north. There are some prograding deltaic sands in the Western Snake River Plain that are dated about 2.5 MA, suggesting that Lake Idaho started to drain by that time. In the Hell's Canyon, we've got that rapid onset of incision at 2.1 MA. It's within the same uncertainty as this 2.5 MA prograding deltaic sand, so we think they're probably related to the same process of draining the lake system through Hell's Canyon. And we think it drained because basically it filled with sediment. The whole basin was full of sediment, bringing the tools of incision, basically what can really cut through the rock, to that bedrock lip between that previously was, prohibiting fast erosion through the canyon system. And in the Columbia Basin, we have that prograding deltaic sand that I showed you some field photos of, that has that really strong upper Missouri provenance, but not as much of the Eastern Snake River Plain in there. Once that happened, once that prograding deltaic sand is really showing up, we think that Lake Ringgold is draining at this time. And we also think that that's when we established the modern drainage of the Columbia River through Wallula Gap, which is a little bit different from its prior configuration. And so that's it. I would be happy to take any questions. I'm really excited to hear what you guys have to think, since you guys are the expert on the geology of what's going on in southwestern Montana. This is from the drainage divide right now in Monida Pass. So I have actually done field work here. So
So what was the main DZ peak or set of peaks that was really like driving the correlation between the Ringgold and the Upper Missouri? Like what ages were specifically like really matching the data well?
I think it's a broad set of ages that are a lot of those Archean ages, and also the Grenville age, I think, was one of those important peaks. I would have to look back at all the plots, but I think those were two of the age peaks that drive that correlation. But that one wasn't it's hard to compare the two of them because one is so far upstream of our proposed drainage and one is so far downstream. So they statistically said there was a similar source to them, but when you plot them on top of each other, they don't look identical, and they shouldn't. Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the same question, but I'm just curious on what's the data that points between the Upper Missouri connecting to the easternmost of the Snake River range? What's the data that makes those two?
So this is something I didn't touch on this talk, but so in the Ruby Graben, there's the 6 Mile Creek Formation and the Timber Hill basalt. That seems to be sourced from potentially the eastern Snake River Plains. So that drainage divide where we now have Monida Pass seems to have not been as much of a drainage divide at the 10 to 6 MA time period. And so the drainage, so it seems like the eastern Snake River Plain was much higher than it is today relative to the Centennial Range, allowing for that drainage into what is now, the Upper Missouri drainage. But then how do you get it from the Upper Missouri River, what is now Upper Missouri River, to the Ringgold Formation? That's actually where I say our breadcrumbs are a bit thin there. We don't have a lot of samples linking, dotting the line between where that river in the 6 Mile Creek Formation area was to the Ringgold Formation. We just know that there's a river that has to be coming in from the northeast to match our northernmost Ringgold Formation samples that has those really old ages. Those Archean ages, those Grenville ages, and they don't seem to be able to, the modern Columbia River drainage that we've sampled and the modern Spokane River, those don't seem to be able to provide the abundance of those old ages and those age groups to match those northern Ringgold Formation samples. We have to have some other source that doesn't exist in the modern network as it is today. And so the best thing that we could basically explain was that that river circumnavigated the northern Rocky Mountains somehow. But yeah, there's a limited number of actual samples we have along that pathway. We dated a few things. We sampled a few things a couple years ago when we were doing field work in the area, but I think we weren't looking at I think I was looking too low, basically low elevation when we were sampling. And for the few samples that we found, there just wasn't like a screaming match between the two. But again, I think it was because we were dating sediments that were too old, basically. Yep.
Could the 6 Mile, if the sources from the 6 Mile, and 6 Mile is being, it's like section 6 miles. Can you exclude, is there a way where you don't have to include the eastern part of the single plane, where it's just resection at 6 Mile?
Well, I think we still need some of the zircon sources that match really well with those Upper Ringgold samples are not just coming from like the eastern Snake River Plain, but specifically like the South Fork and the Henry's Fork. So that's that sort of uppermost portion. And so those ones seem to be really important in driving our models in the right direction and getting the best fits to our provenance analyses. Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of wiggle room in there, but I guess that's sort of the difficulty with using modern drainages to explain the past is that, what you've sampled from your sand is not always like the prior configuration. But the fact that the 6 Mile Creek Formation has some statistical similarities to the Ringgold Formation, and that we still need a lot of those upper snake drainages and the eastern Snake River Plain to explain some of our Ringgold Formation samples, to me, kind of links the dots between those rivers somehow being connected.
Yeah, I feel like when we toured Colleen and Lydia and I were chatting, I mean, my impression is, from 10 to 6-ish, even a little past, uniting the eastern Snake River Plain with the upper part of the Missouri seems like pretty plausible to us. But I guess one thing that we were thinking about or talking about is how you then unite the upper part of the Missouri and southwestern Montana into the
Yeah,
Columbia,
yeah,
was kind of something we were thinking about. So that might be kind of a interesting feature thing to
absolutely.
test with more,
Yeah,
sampling of 6 Mile Creek age sediments.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this portion of the diagram, this landscape is where I think a lot more focused sampling and a little bit more time to really look at the stratigraphy would be super helpful at, either proving me right or proving me wrong. And I'm happy with either way.
And I feel like, we had Rob Thomas give a talk and correct me if I'm wrong, but, kind of the alternative model of Thomas and Sears, that they still kind of unite the eastern Snake River Plain and southwestern Montana. They just have it turn to the east.
Yeah.
And go out. The headwaters of Missouri are still the headwaters of Missouri, whereas Lydia's statistical modeling suggests that actually curve to the west. And then
Yeah. And I think
headwaters of Missouri used to be the headwaters of the Columbia.
Yeah. And I think both models are totally viable because like the proposed Bell River that's going to Hudson Bay, it makes sense that a lot of the zircons are coming also from that, a lot of the geology in Montana, but you don't need like all of the area to be involved in that drainage. Like if we take just a little cut of it, if we just get a couple little zircons from southwest Montana into Washington, I think both, the drainage divide is somewhere in that range, somewhere between where they propose it and for the Bell River and where we propose it for the Ringgold samples.
It's very fitting because it's right for we're mapping in Dillon and Wisdom.
Yeah, and if
That's right through.
I mean, it's like we just need this, right? Just this little guy right here, and it's kind of easy to connect the dots across that, right? Like that kind of looks like a weird chunk. I think it's plausible.
I mean, thinking about just like, if you were to drive from Oneida Pass and follow as best you could all the way to the Ringgold,
Mm-hmm.
like a good portion in the red there, you'd just be driving through belt rocks and looking at the same thing,
Yeah.
So I would expect there would just be a huge giant slug of belt DZs in the Ringgold.
So yeah, but like this sample that we have from the Columbia River, it captures that. And Spokane has that in it too. But if you look at oh gosh, it's way in the front of my talk. It's like the second slide, basically. Oh, it was here. Okay, so the Spokane River, it's got some of those. And the Columbia River's got like that much. Yeah. The little bump right there. Mm-hmm. But the Ringgold Formation, and I should have plotted this actually. It looks like this, like the relative abundance is like high, and those Grenville ages too. And so those ages are, sorry, Sam, that's a salmon. Those ages are in there, but the relative abundance, it's so hard to get the Ringgold to look like this without some, especially, these Grenville ages are important.
Yeah, so what do you think about the fertility of zircon and belt rocks? Like, are they actually shedding the zircons into the fluvial system, or are they just, being deposited as smaller and smaller pieces of gravel? Do you think the belt is actually contributing a lot, or what?
That's a really good question. I don't know exactly. You probably have a better group.
Our success at getting zircon out of belt rock,
yeah,
6 doors down, has not been super high.
Yeah.
It seems to take just the right. You have to grind them really, really fine. Basically.
Yeah. But, I mean, rivers are good at grinding stuff down.
Yeah.
But what we do see a lot, and this is also something I didn't talk about too much, is that in the Columbia River right now, there's a lot of quartzite, but different kinds of quartzite. And there's this one really golden quartzite that everyone has always said oh, the golden quartzite comes from the belt rocks. And so maybe some of that really finer grain stuff is from the belt. But yeah, the zircons, it's not really getting the high abundance. It's it's what's up in the upper snake that's really driving that
That's
portion.
interesting.
Yeah.
You answer Stuart's question by getting DZs from cobbles
hmm
and from the sand in the same deposit.
Yeah, one could do that. I haven't tried that yet.
And it's, yeah. And because belt rocks really are pretty distinctive.
hmm
You'd think they'd be really obvious about,
And I mean,
Yeah.
it's really interesting what you say about the Henry's Fork too, because I know, when I was working in Menida Pass, I was, referencing and reading some of J.D. Love's stuff and Ryder and Schulten's stuff. And, people have tried to make the tie between the Harebell and Pinion
Uh-huh.
formations over there, which just fill the Teton Valley and everything.
Like the Tiwanoot formation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so they've been trying to make the case that those were from the belt, but
hmm
like the most modern DZ work of Malone says that they actually aren't a very good fit for the belt.
Mm.
They're better fit for quartzites that are younger than the belt that do have these Grenville ages. So anyway, it's interesting to see how, something about those quartzites there maybe are much more fertile
hmm
than the belt. And I feel like that's kind of underappreciated
hmm
when people are looking at belt age DZs.
hmm
But and maybe there's a way to sort of subdivide, I don't know, maybe there's an important difference between the Lemhi subbasin and the Deer Trail group equivalents
Yeah.
from the belt and how much zircons they can add to the mix.
Yeah, I mean, Dan already showed there's a lot of variability in the DC spectra that are coming from a lot of those different units that are all sort of often lumped together, it seems. So, yeah.
I was wondering, have you tried to look for the ancestral measure the connection with the snake with people? Could it go through the Centennial Valley as opposed to Middle Pass and through Homer's Lake? Because that range would presume an active range extension
hmm
way back in nice and time. We don't know. But,
I know that there's a
it's an obstacle. It was an active fault project back.
I know that there's like a northeast trending fault that has it's like down to the west that has sediments on the west side that the Centennial Fault cuts across. Is that right, Mike? I think yeah. So there are Miocene sediments in that half graben. I don't know the age. I don't know if that's the case. But so I think there was a like the modern Centennial Valley cuts across whatever that older structure is that was probably Miocene. So there might be some age constraint there you'd have to think about.
I feel like just to respect everyone's time, we can continue questions at Butte Brewery afterwards with some beer. So let's give Lydia round of applause.